Hi everyone, this is Dr. Raquel Butler from Integrated Veterinary Therapeutics.
And Sophie Vandenberg from Equine Postulate. And we welcome you to the Equine Functional Posture Podcast, your ultimate source for insights into the influence of functional posture on biomechanics, health, and overall well-being of horses.
Whether you're a seasoned equestrian, an equine professional, or simply a horse enthusiast, this podcast is designed to help you understand the critical aspects of functional posture.
Tune in each week as we discuss practical tips, delve into expert interviews, and explore the latest research in the impact of functional posture on equine anatomy, physiology, movement, and more.
Let's create a world where we empower our horses to be in a mental, emotional, and physical balance. Hi everyone, welcome to today's episode. Have you ever wondered if your horse's posture, resistance under saddle, or subtle behaviour changes might be linked to their tack? How are you going today, Soph?
Hi, Raquel. I'm going really well. This is an awesome discussion. We're diving into the world and topic of saddle fit today. So we're going to talk about how it impacts your horse's posture, what signs you can look for, and why getting saddle fit is so essential for both long-term comfort, but then also your performance and partnership, because the way our horse experiences what we do with them influences our relationship really strongly.
Yeah, it's really an important topic. I studied saddle fit, I don't know, about 10 more than 10 years ago now. And I did it for a bit in my practice, and I found it extremely frustrating. And I spent many hours, and what I realized later as I learnt more, that I spent many hours trying to fit saddles that were never going to fit. And trying to kind of, I guess, please clients with the saddles that they had so that they didn't have to buy a new saddle. But at the end of the day, there are just some saddles that don't work for particular shapes of horses, and it's really a minefield in terms of finding that perfect saddle fit, because we have to consider, both the static posture of the horse, so what their top line and everything is like when they're standing there. But the challenge is that you can't tell how a horse moves often by just looking at that static aspect of the horse. So if we're only looking at how the saddle fits when they're standing there, it doesn't give us a great indication of how it fits when they're moving. And for example, Patch, like when she stood, a pony that I had, when she just stood there for her saddle fit, like she didn't have a good thoracic sling, she had a dropped back, and then when she moved, she actually lifted me up, and there was probably a bit of brace there, but her whole back shape completely changed. And even I had a saddle fitter at the time, and she was like, oh, okay, like I didn't expect her to move like that. So when we're looking at things like saddle fit, we need to think about it both when the horse moves and when the horse is static. So you can start to get a feel for that as a rider, but also a good saddle fitter will look at both aspects of that. So that's really important. But when we say, saddle fit's just so important for the horse's posture and biomechanics, why is it so important? Like, how can just a little imbalance in the fit of the saddle have such a massive impact on the horse's posture and biomechanics?
So, that's a very broad question because there's so many reasons why. One being that the saddle sits above the rib cage. So the rib cage itself is a space where, the organs are inside a cavity. And so you don't have any musculature sitting right underneath the thoracic spine. So the thoracic spine being, between the base of the neck and where the lumbar starts. And that is the space, before the lumbar, sort of behind the shoulder to the lumbar is where the saddle sits. And so underneath that space, there isn't muscles holding it up. All of the muscles that we talk about as the core, they sit all the way underneath the belly. And so
and on top of the back,
and over
well,
the back,
like over the top of the spine, over the top of the rib cage.
So the ribs need to be able to function. We do tighten up a saddle around that space as well. There's a level of compression that we're bringing to that space around the rib cage. And that whole area, there's the motion of the breathing, there's the motion through the body when the horse is in motion that you were talking about, that are very different to when they're standing still. And so if your saddle fit isn't optimal for the horse, and you're looking at a balance between, you're trying to find something that fits standing still when they're working, and throughout all the different points of development, there's a lot that goes into fitting a saddle that's going to work for your horse realistically.
Yeah, and then you want the saddle to also work for you. And, different riders will like different things. Like some riders like to feel very secure in the saddle, and other riders like a more open seat where they have a bit more ability to move. And so you're not only fitting the saddle to the horse, you're also fitting it to yourself as a rider. Like, there's some saddle fitters who talk about the difference between the female and male pelvis. Also, we have different lengths of our thigh bones, and different things going on, different balance, different stability within our own body. So these are all considerations when, we're fitting the saddle, and they have a massive influence on the horse. And I have a saddle that has a flex tree. And one of the things that I noticed, I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but one of the things that I notice is I can feel a lot coming through the saddle from my horse, but B, my horse can feel a lot coming through the saddle from me. And so I, had a disc problem, and my right leg doesn't work the same as my left leg. And I can really, because I'm very aware, I've created that awareness over, a lot of time. I can feel when my balance is influencing my horse, and how I'll be leaning. And then that compounded with their challenges, like their balance challenges or stability or asymmetry or laterality or whatever they've got going on in their body, can yeah, just kind of add that extra postural challenge to the horse. So just highlights that importance.
So if you're talking about how the horse and their body, you can see it both it shows up in how the saddle's fitting, and you can feel it when you're riding. What kind of fascial connections do you think, show up really strongly, when you're talking about saddle fit?
Yeah, well, the saddle sits directly over the thoracolumbar fascia. And so when you think about that, it's like a dynamic cling film spider web layer that's sitting over those back muscles. But the interesting thing with that fascia is it's a continuation into the latissimus dorsi, which goes down below, it extends down through the girth area into the inner aspect of the shoulder. And so we're having direct impact on the shoulder by sitting on their back, and it extends towards the tail over the glute into the superficial gluteal and then below the hip joint. So however, whatever's happening in that back is going to have a really significant impact on how the shoulder moves and how the hip moves, let alone, the direct muscular connections that go along the back, such as the longissimus dorsi, which connects from the pelvis into the neck up to C3 at least. And, that's just, and then we've got like the supraspinous ligament that goes all the way along the back, which is a continuation of the nuchal ligament funicular cord. And a whole complexity of muscles that are sitting where that saddle sits. And so that's why, one of the areas that we see, is how that muscle drops away when we've got poor saddle fit issues happening, and we'll go into that a little bit more. But, we need to allow that fascia, like fascia hydration is really important. And so if we're creating compression through that fascia, we're compressing all the little capillaries in the horse's back. And it doesn't take long for those capillaries to become so damaged that, you know, we've got a significant reduction of circulation in the back. And then over time, you end up with, you know, nerve damage and it just, you know, spinal damage, spinal arthritis, kissing spine, you know, it's a progression from there. So, you know, what also would you say a healthy saddle enables the horse's back, a healthy saddle fit enables the horse's back to do?
Generally to move well and achieve the aims that you're looking for in general good movement. So that it allows dynamic motion, particularly through the scapula. It allows the horse to lift the base of the sternum, and the base of the neck, so be able to lift through the wither. It won't block that space. It allows them to reach underneath and enable their core to engage so that they can truly, you know, have stability through their spine and then develop a top line. So that is one, you know, you're talking about a decrease in circulation to a space. If you have a lot of compression, decrease in circulation, you're actually going to have a decrease in the ability for the muscle to repair and grow in that space. So you're more likely, we'll talk about that later, but your top line won't develop, or it'll, you know, decrease in size when you're working to improve. So if a good saddle fit is something that you always need to consider when you're aiming to improve your top line, or you think that there's some kind of improvement to be made through the musculature of the back.
Yeah, and then that allows the thoracic sling to work appropriately. It allows the pelvis to, like you talked about, the hind end being able to come under. So it enables that pelvic motion to work optimally, and it allows the spine to be able to go through motion. So there's enough space in the gullet through the center of the saddle that allows for spinal motion. And some horses are quite thick through the tops of their vertebrae, and they actually need a fair amount of space. And so a well-fitting saddle will allow the spine to, as you said, you know, lift up at the base of the wither. So it'll allow the spine to flex and come up underneath the saddle, and it'll also allow it to have like side bending and rotation, lateral flexion through there, and it'll spread the load across the musculature as much as possible while having appropriate concussion absorption. So your panel materials are going to be really important for that, like whether you have wool, synthetic, foam. There are a few of the options as to how much it's going to absorb concussion. And also the stability of the saddle. So you want the saddle to allow for that dynamic motion, but you don't want the saddle like moving around all over the place. So while allowing motion, the saddle also has to be stable, and this is the challenge of saddle fit, you know. And I actually don't think that there's a perfect model that I've, you know, come across yet, a perfect model that for saddle fit that suits every horse, because there's just such a massive variety of horses and riders and type of work that I think we need to keep a very open mind for, you know, I have riders who ride in treeless, I have riders who ride in a what's it called, total, I think, contact, where it doesn't have a whole saddle, it just goes across the front of the wither. And you know, I like those horses' backs look amazing. It's not, and I have, like, I was speaking to one client yesterday and she has a treeless saddle for one horse, the total contact solutions, I think, for another horse. And like her horse's backs are fabulous, but she does a lot of movement and a lot of variation. And I think that's a big key. So I really believe we have to be open to different options for different horses. Like I have the flex tree saddle. I don't think that's the perfect saddle for every horse and every rider. it wasn't great for me when I lacked stability. So, you know, we have to kind of consider that amount of variation.
So if we talk about, well, firstly, I think just overall, really you're saying poor saddle fit isn't just a comfort issue. You know, that's often like what the conversation is based around when, you know, I think it's something that people do recognize is uncomfortable, particularly because as the saddle goes on, you often get a really strong response from your horse. They might turn to bite. Often they'll sidestep while the saddle goes on. You know, there's something that correlates because it's quite a definitive event. You know, the saddle is going on, the horse shows a response at that time. But we're saying there is a physiological aspect to that as well to consider. A decrease in circulation decreases the muscle quality, and also the rest of the body, because it's so connected between the fascia, biomechanics, and motion. You know, there's no way to isolate the effect that the saddle is having on the horse's back away from the rest of the body, basically.
Yeah, and it's specifically, you know, you're going to have a big influence on how the horse is able to recruit their muscles, like posturally, and just their general muscles, like what muscles they're recruiting for motion and what muscles they're able to recruit for motion. And the other aspect of that is also the effect that it has on the spine over time. So I mentioned like kissing spine, but also nerve compression. You know, if you've got a lot of fascial tension, then over time the nerve roots that come out of the spine are going to, and there's lots of little nerves, and they even talk now about, you know, how innervated fascia is. So over time, those nerves are becoming less, and you can get a horse then that is not showing pain when you run your hand through their back because it's so damaged that it's kind of beyond that. And I've seen a lot of ponies, especially because we have a lot of chunky ponies, you know. They're very wide, and it's often very difficult to get a saddle that's wide enough to allow them, you know, optimal function. And so, you know, I've seen ponies that have probably had bad saddle fit for years and years, and they barely complained because they get away with it because they've had a lighter rider, and children are generally more balanced and more stable than adults. And, you know, the clients have come to me when the horse is maybe doing some pig rooting in canter, or maybe you know, the horse is starting to refuse jumps or something obvious like that. And then I've looked at the back and there's just chronic, you know, the horse has been putting up with poor saddle fit for years and they're not really even showing the signs anymore. And so that's where we have to, you know, increase our observation skills so that us as horse owners and riders can recognize these signs in these little stoic ponies before, you know, such amount of damage is done, because the subtle signs would have been there. And whether it's a fact that it's been trained out of them or they just love their kid, because I have seen ponies that just adore their kids and so they just will do anything for that child. Yeah, it's our responsibility to recognize those early signs and start to create some awareness then. And then the horses will tell us a bit more about that. So you kind of mentioned some of the early signs before, but what kind of things can people look for before they even hop on their horse?
So you can just do a pre-ride check. Glance over your horse. Once you have taken stock of your horse over a number of times, you begin to notice changes as well. You know, that gives you the opportunity. It's not about, is there something wrong, but also, does something change in the future? So we talked about the horse's response to the saddle. They might turn around to nip at you. They might sidestep. Or I often, when I ask people about, you know, what their horse's response is to the saddle, they say, oh, he doesn't like to stand still in that space. And so they shuffle a lot, or they'll constantly shift weight shift between their legs as the saddle's going on. Often they put their head up as well. You get this kind of like just raising of the head. And when you look at their back, it just gets a little sink as they do it. That's quite common. So you also get a pinched face. You know, the chin will often have like a little twitch to it, and their nose gets tense, and their eye, often their ears just set back a little bit, or they get a frozen face. So watching their response to the saddle, even a tail swish also is very common. But you can also have a look at your horse's stance. So having a look at what their back shape and their musculature is, you can ask them to do a belly lift to, you know, assess what kind of lift you're seeing in that space and what the muscles do, you know, in the wither pocket and along the back when you ask them to engage. When you go to mount, you know, do they get antsy? Do they start to walk off? Do they, or, you know, I do have one client, her horse is super communicative, and she knows he's just like, I'm not going near the mounting block. It's not happening today. And she'll be like, okay, well, we need to do something else. And that's just quite a definitive yes or no. I do feel like doing that, or I don't feel like doing that today. So, you know, does the horse not want to approach a spot where you would normally get on? So that's a really big one. The other one is, does my horse have a twitchy wither? So that can be when you run your hand over it, if you're going to do a little groom in that spot, or if you're giving them a little scratch, but also as you go to put the saddle pad on or the saddle, do they get that? It's like a shaking response, almost like a fly twitch response where all the skin goes shaky. And you often see it, you know, through the wither and across the top of the shoulder blade, across the top of the scapula. So those are a few signs. Can you think of anything else?
Yeah, I think the important thing to note is that if a horse is giving you some kind of aversive behavior related to the saddle, you know, such as all the things that you've said, turning around to kind of look at you, kicking towards the saddle, like all the other things you said, like moving away, etc. I've had a lot of people say things like, but it could be just a habit, or um, or something along those lines. And I think we have to be really careful with that because A, we're not in the horse's body. We cannot say what they are actually feeling when you tighten the girth up. You cannot 100% say that their thoracic vertebrae are all working optimally, that their ribs are all comfortable, you know, that when you put that saddle on and do it up, everything is like functioning. And so far, I have not come across a horse where, you know, where, especially when it's persisted. So there is a point at which you've corrected the function, and then the next few times that you put the saddle and girth on, you may have to do some, you know, positive reinforcement, some reassurance to say actually like you do have function. But you need to know they have function, you know. So when I'm assessing function, I'm like, yes, the rib cage moves. Yes, all the thoracic vertebrae have normal motion. The girth area feels comfortable. There's no scarring through the pecs that are creating a problem. The forelimb can move optimally. They can do a super comfortable, easy belly lift, you know, where there's no I don't have to create pressure for that belly lift to occur. Their back feels nice. They're not reacting to any of those things. So, you know, even yesterday I was treating a horse. He's a little 4-year-old, and she said to me, like, yeah, he does turn around and just look at me when I do up the girth, and he will lift his back leg. And she said, you know, because he's young, it's like, does he just, you know, not, and he was a standardbred, like, does he just not like the saddle yet? You know, does he just still getting used to it kind of thing? But then being able to assess him, I was able to say, well, actually, no, his cranial wither vertebrae, so the ones closer to the head, were actually crooked. and they didn't have normal motion. So that was one thing that I found. Then there was a little bit of tension through his pecs where the girth is going to sit. And then there was a whole nother pattern happening in the rest of his body, like his hyoid was super restricted. And, so it's like, no, I actually think there's enough dysfunction here to create that response. And so that's where, as a horse owner, you can be a bit limited because you can't go in and go, oh yeah, I can feel that those two vertebrae aren't moving and that the hyoid is restricted, and so that's where we have the equine functional posture course to help people develop those skills. But until you have someone that's assessing their whole structure, you can't 100% ever say that it's a behavioral response to the saddle and it's not a comfort functional response. So like Jelly will, when he's all comfortable, I just girth him up, there's nothing. When he's not comfortable, I'd feel him just blow out slightly. And so you could say, oh, well, like he doesn't turn to bite me, he doesn't kick, he doesn't move, he doesn't swish his tail. It's nothing, it's just a slight blowout. But I know when he slightly blows out that he's not as functional as he can be, because when he is, it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that when he walks off, when everything is happy, he walks off easily, comfortably. But if he walks off and he's hesitating a little bit, then I'm like, something's not quite right. Or I hop on and he just takes a while to stride out. I'm like, okay, something is not quite right. So it's taking note of those signs, and I guess it's hard until you've felt and seen the difference, because then it goes, oh yeah, well that was a problem. And so I always trust the horse's communication, until I've exhausted all of my options of checking structure and function, because so far they haven't been wrong.
I would say too, for most, well, not most, but often I will receive the comment that the horse only does this sometimes. And I think it's important to recognize that inconsistent signs are still signs that are not just somebody being moody or being, in a poor mood today or something like that. It doesn't have to mean that your horse is always comfortable, except when they're doing that behavior. It's just at this moment that that behavior that could represent discomfort, the horse is really, really values making it clear that there's something going on. So things that are inconsistent, say, oh, it only happens sometimes. It still has meaning and it's worth taking notice of.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And then I was also just thinking of another example. So recently I changed Jelly's girth. So we talk a lot about saddle fit, but girth fit and comfort is really important as well. And I was always questioning whether his girth was the right girth for the saddle. But recently I changed his girth, and the difference, like in the way that he feels riding him, is quite pronounced. So like he feels more able to lift through his back, he's more open through his back. He just, straight away strides out better. And yeah, just there is quite a difference. So also we talk a lot about saddle fit, but don't discount the girth and the pad fit, which we'll kind of reiterate towards the end, because with my saddle I can change the pads and I'm constantly looking at that, and that will influence how he feels and how I feel, but also depends on what type of work we're doing. So if we're on a trail ride, this is also something else to consider, so I've just segued a little bit, but if we're on a trail ride, my saddle fits differently to if I'm riding in an arena, because on a trail ride he's just going along looking at the world. So his posture is very different on a trail ride, and I don't like my saddle for trail riding because it doesn't have the support for us when we're just slooping along, like this the same way. Whereas when I'm riding, out like in the arena, well then I'm in a different posture and he's in a very different posture. So my saddle fits very differently in that situation because he's engaging himself better, he's lifting through his back better, and we're thinking more about how we're both using our bodies. So it's a very different position to going out for a trail ride. And so just think about that aspect as well. That, can be different in different situations. So what kind of things might people feel? So we kind of talked about pre-ride responses. The horse's response to the saddle, taking notice of their stance, back shape, musculature, belly lift, response to being mounted, twitchiness, girthiness, facial expressions. What kind of thing can we look at during work?
So during work, some signs you might see could be a reluctance to move forward. Can also be a shortening of the stride, might feel like a choppy gait, both in the walk and a trot. Often, the canter gets very short too. Like it feels
They
like
might not want to canter.
Yeah, Joyce Harmon, in her book, she describes that you often feel like you roll very hard into one shoulder when you're having a problem with saddle fit in the canter. Also, you can have the saddle slipping or shifting to one side. And so, that there's some really great images that were circulating a little while ago about having a look at your horses. When your horse stands square and you're sitting in the saddle and you have a look from behind, if you have somebody take a picture or they stand behind, is one panel sinking lower into their muscle, or is it shifted? If they're standing behind, does it look like the center channel of the saddle is sitting straight over your horse's spine? Does it look like it's shifting to one side? And that's important too. We haven't really talked about the person on the horse, but if you, like you said, you have one leg that struggles, is a little bit weaker than the other side and you can't feel it, it's really important that there's maybe somebody who can help observe you. And we'll talk later about saddle fitters too, but they, like you said, having somebody assess you while you're riding is really valuable, because all of those things that you can't see once you're sitting in the saddle are, they're important things to consider.
Yeah, and I think if your trainer is telling you all the time, put your leg back, or you're leaning forward, sit back, like if they're always telling you the same things, you need to consider saddle fit with that, because sometimes you're trying to do the position correctly, but you actually can't because of the position that the saddle is sitting you in. So just consider, or if you're always getting a sore back, then also that can be a sign of poor saddle fit. Like I rode Delhi out the other day, and previously he'd needed some extra padding at the back, which is not common, and I don't recommend that you do it. It's for specific things, but he didn't need it the other day, but I put it on because it was already in, I hadn't ridden him for a little bit, and I did some things to his diet, and his top line has changed. And when I got back, my back was killing me, because the way it was sitting me in the position. And I took them out on the weekend when I rode at riding club, and it was like my back was much better. So if you're kind of consistently getting sore, and it's the same when this is not saddle fit necessarily, but when I canter, sometimes when Jelly's canter's not good, my back's really sore, and then when his canter's lovely, my back doesn't get sore. So taking note of those things within your own body can also be indicators of saddle fit issues. But you might also notice things in your horse, like they're tripping and stumbling. So that could be an indicator, or they feel a bit lame when you're riding them, but you can't see it when you're not riding them. They might show something like resistance to downward transitions. Like you see the horse that as you come into the downward transition, they put their head up because they're trying to not engage their back because it's uncomfortable, or they rush into upward or downward transitions, or you feel like they're harder to pull up, like they're pulling, or they're really on the forehand because they don't want to lift up into the comfort of the saddle. Other things that I've seen are also, if people are trying to get their horse to move sideways, if the saddle is pinching, the horse won't want to move sideways because it just puts the spine, it's just compressing the spine more.
And if you have interference with the scapula as well, asking them for lateral motion is going to be, it's restricting what you're asking them to move.
And same with canters, strike-offs, right? Like if they can't move their scapula appropriately, then they might not want to strike off, or they could hop into the canter. You might also just struggle to get your horse straight and engaging, like feeling like they're lifting through their back. You might feel like you have to ride them every stride just because the motion isn't effortless. Like I know when things are aligned, when all the universe stars are aligned, I can just sit there and Jelly's back comes up under me. I allow my pelvis to open, and it's like, it's just beautiful, I'm just sitting there and he's actually carrying me and I'm carrying myself in that motion, and it's effortless, and that's what we're kind of aiming for, is that the more effortless it is and the more efficient that it is, we're each carrying ourselves, and then we're working like dance partners in motion, and it's a beautiful feeling. So yeah, they're kind of some of the things you might notice during work. The other thing would be landing a jump. If sometimes you'll see a horse land the jump and then they'll kind of do a lot of tail swishing, or they might pig root after they land the jump, and that can be the front of the saddle specifically jamming into the back of the scapulas, which, fitting a jumping saddle is very different to fitting a dressage saddle. Or they might hate it when you do sitting trot and they put the head up and hollow their back when you're doing sitting trot. And then, you talked about the laterals there as well. So I think that kind of gives you a bit of an idea of what to look for during work that could be related to saddle fit.
If we look at post work, you're thinking about what can I see in my horse once I've hopped off, or even once I take the saddle off. I'm just thinking to myself about, hiking, wearing a backpack, the difference for me between wearing, especially when I'm carrying, the difference carrying at the start of a 8 to 10 day trail versus at the end where you've got a lot less food and weight, is very different. But the difference in wearing a poor quality pack as opposed to a good quality one, and also whether it fits you, you've been able to adjust it to yourself. There are so many things you see at the end of the day. I know for me that comes down to where the bruises were on my hips, when the straps are over my shoulders, like one side will rub, and the other side didn't. Or on my back, one side of my back or one shoulder gets really sore. There's so many things that show up even when you think you have tightened them perfectly, and you don't want to be uncomfortable, or it feels like it's not rubbing. Like I cannot tell that I'm rubbing, and yet at the end of the day I have a blister underneath one side. So many things show up, and I think that's a good representation of, even if you can't see it, you should be listening to your horse anyway. The behaviors that show up tell us so much. You just did a webinar on that. And, even if you can't see it, it's worth considering that something still isn't perfect, because I know, in that example, I feel like, I've had it professionally fitted by somebody who has spent months of their life hiking and knows all the stuff. And then it looks like it's perfectly fitted to me. It doesn't move. And I go out and I'm like, I've got a blister on day one on my hip. So
they generally fit it to you in a static position, and just maybe watch you walk a few steps, not walk for 6 hours in it, which is really going to show up, the issues, which is the same with the saddle fit. Like, sometimes you might need, especially a brand new saddle, you need a fair few rides for it to settle in, and also to see how your horse is progressively moving under that.
Definitely. So uneven sweat marks or dry patches. is something that often stands out, and that you can assess regularly as well. Every time you take the saddle off, am I seeing uneven sweat marks and dry patches? Girth galls are a good one to check for, especially, it's something I've had a couple of clients say that changing their girth 10 times made no difference with girth galls until a saddle change made a difference. So there's a reciprocal relationship in both spaces, how you're, and there are so many things to consider, everything from your girth points and how many attachment points, where the buckles are in relation to the saddle itself, and the sensitivity of your horse's skin and the material of all of those things. They're very individual to the horses. Looking for rub marks or motion in a spot is really a valuable thing to look at post work. What are things you'd suggest people look for?
I think a big one is the saddle imprint. So, I will look at Jelly's back pre-work and go, yep, okay, looks good. It's all smooth and full. And then I'll look post-work and I'll ask myself, can I see where the saddle was sitting? Like, you might have a sweat mark where your saddle was, but like, what does the musculature look like? Because if the musculature looks more contracted and dipped post-ride, or you can see an obvious imprint, so it's not the sweat patch I'm talking about like, you can see an imprint in the muscles where the saddle has been sitting, then you need to consider your saddle fit and perhaps the way you're riding as well, because that's an indicator that the back muscles haven't filled up while you've been riding. They haven't increased circulation, they've decreased circulation. And so that can be anything from saddle fit to the type of work that you're doing and how your horse is carrying themselves and how you're riding. But yeah, the saddle imprint is a big one. And then running your hands along their back, feeling for lumps, bumps. So, I know a few times I've come back from a ride and there'll be like a little raised area on Jelly's spine in one specific spot. And I'm like, okay, what happened there? So did I sit my pads in a little bit different position today? Like, what's going on there? So then I'll have a look at that. So if there's little raised areas that come up along the spine or through the back, if you feel spasms through the back, like lumps, like bigger lumps, like not skin lumps, but like in the muscle, especially I find them at the back of the saddle. And if when you go to touch them, they dip away from you, and there's increased sensitivity. And I'll often also check Jelly post-ride, is the belly lift the same as pre-ride? So if I ask him for a gentle belly lift, do I get the same responses that I got pre-ride? Or, can now I not get the belly lift and he's showing me some signs of grumpiness? So they're probably the main things that I'm looking at post-ride. Oh, actually, there's one more thing. The loin, so the lumbar area, and you can see this as the horse is being ridden as well. So if say the saddle's too narrow or there's a lot of compression, you'll often see either a weak tight area behind the saddle or a raised full area behind the saddle where it's trying to brace and stabilize and kind of help the horse use the hind end. So it's kind of compensating for the inability for the back to lift and the hind limb to come under, but you're still asking for hind limb engagement, so they kind of like brace through that lower back area. And so if you check through that lower back area and there's a lot of brace, tension, irregularity, which is where the middle gluteal tongue comes up, then I'm asking, okay, what's the comfort under the saddle? So if we kind of think about, just general indicators, you're just looking at your horse. So we've kind of talked about pre-work, during work, post-work changes that you might see. Now, just some general postural indicators, so you're just looking at your horse in the paddock. What kind of things could be indicators that they've had saddle fit challenges? And it might not be right now, it could be that they've had their saddle fit challenges in the past, but you do want to kind of improve the health of their back.
So some postural indicators might be wastage in the wither pocket area. So that's just behind the scapula in the top line. You might see a drop thoracic sling. So we have an episode on assessing your thoracic sling, but basically it's just the idea that your rib cage is kind of like falling between your scapulas. That's a really big deal because it's just a big indicator that we don't have a lifted and engaged thoracic sling and an engaged core. You might see a disengaged pelvis. So you often see that with a pelvis that, when the hind limb is engaged, it's either directly, underneath the horse and then behind rather than coming under nicely. And it doesn't look like the pelvis has a nice figure eight motion where the horse is stepping underneath himself well. You will often see a weak neck. So there's a hollowness in sort of the middle of the base of the neck. So it's right in front of the scapula. If you follow the bones of the neck, it's underneath where the nuchal ligament is and sort of above the actual cervical bones. There's a space in there that often it's quite hollow and underdeveloped, and it's less so than the bones underneath it. And those horses often present as looking like they're quite ewe-necked, but they're not conformationally. It's just postural and development. And lastly, there's often a lot of tail tension. So the tail is held out stiffly behind them or even to one side when they're moving, when they do, often a wee or a poo. As they move their tail, it just looks very uncomfortable and stiff. And going around that, those horses often, they tail swish a fair bit as well. So those are just strong postural indicators that you can just see in your horse. When you consider the kind of effects, that are either represented in the rider or what they feel, what would you give people as a small list of things to notice or look for?
Yeah, I think as a rider, when, there's saddle fit challenges, you kind of feel like you're not able to be at one with the horse. And so it's just a bit more of a struggle to maintain your own stability and balance. And so often you'll see people having to rely on the reins more because they can't stabilize themselves in the saddle, specifically in rising trot. Like when you want to come up in the rising trot, where your leg is going to dictate your efficiency and your ability to rise. So if the saddle is leaning backwards, your legs are going to be in front of you, and that's not a great place to push from. If the saddle is tipping forwards and your legs are behind you, it's going to make you lean forward and push you forward. So that aspect of it. Also, you might feel like you're kind of getting bounced out of the saddle. Sometimes that can be just lameness in the horse as well as saddle fit. And then other kind of things are you struggle, your horse is not able to receive your aids as well. So they're not as responsive to your seat and legs. They're not able to improve in their ability to respond to you because you're not able to communicate your aids as effectively because your position is being challenged, but also they're not able to move effectively either because of the saddle. So yeah, and I think like we said earlier, if your trainer is constantly saying to you, sit back, sit forward, legs back, something along those lines, then you need to consider how the saddle is actually sitting you in that position and how it's making you move as well.
Yeah. So So often something I hear quite commonly is my saddle has been fitted, even when I think I might be seeing a culmination of issues that would make me ask a question about saddle fit. If somebody, said, what can I do as a horse owner? And this includes people who say my saddle has been fitted. What are some things that they can do either at home, think about, or ask their saddle fitter for, systems to implement saddle fitting, etc.? What would be your key things to recommend?
Yeah, I think being able to assess your horse's back and just having awareness of what a healthy back looks like and kind of what you're aiming towards. So that's definitely really valuable, and the more you can improve your awareness of good posture, which is why we developed the equine functional posture course as well, to really help people in those assessment skills.
Yeah.
I think also people sometimes think, well, I did get my saddle fitted when I got it, or my saddle was custom made to fit my horse. I've seen a lot of custom made saddles that don't fit the horse. A, because sometimes the saddle fitter hasn't come back after they've made the saddle, they've just done it from a template. But B, the horse's back changes all the time. And if you have a horse like Jelly who has a muscle condition, his back can change from today to tomorrow, So you need to consider when it was last fitted, and a good amount of time is definitely no more than 6 months, but every 3 to 6 months, if your horse has had a change in weight, a change in workload, often, when I'm working with horses from a bodywork perspective, we're aiming for their body to really change. And so, sometimes I'm like, okay, just stay off the horse for a bit. We'll get the posture and shape and function better. Then we'll get your saddle fitted. And then, we're not going to be undoing what we're trying to do. And I also have seen where saddles have been professionally fitted, everything's like going super well. And then and this is where having a good body worker is really valuable. And then I've come in and gone, oh, the back was looking great, but now it's just changed, and we need to get the saddle refitted now. So if you have that booked in, especially if it was a new saddle and made a massive difference, and then we couldn't get the saddle fitter for another month, I think it was, and by then we'd lost the benefit. And so then we were fitting to a back that was now dysfunctional due to the saddle. So you're better off to kind of have that regular fitting, especially when you're trying to create postural change. And if you're observing that every ride and you empower yourselves with, basic skills for saddle assessment, which, we'll have more podcasts on this because we've just kind of gone into signs today. But, the more you empower yourself and you can recognize changes in the balance, changes in your horse, then you can go, okay, I need a saddle fit, or you just have them booked in regularly. The other thing I'd consider is when you've had your saddle fitted, the saddle fitter will fit it to a specific pad, a specific saddle blanket, and a specific pad. Changing that, adding more padding, is not an answer to overcome saddle fitting problems. Sometimes it creates more of a problem, and changing the saddle pad can change the fit that the saddle fitter has created for your horse. So be very aware that the saddle pad that you use and the girth is a very important part of saddle fit. So just changing those things means you've changed the fit of your saddle.
It's just, there's a lot to consider there. I mean, we had a discussion about even, people, the material that they're using on either their saddle pad itself, or as, for things using shimming or extra comfort. I was thinking about one horse that I saw where a cutout for a wither issue was actually causing irritation, because as it, created drag on the outside of the wither, it was pulling down. And so that space on top of the wither, the skin was actually being pulled really hard, and there was a compression over the top of the wither simply because it was dragging down. So there's a lot to consider that's quite dynamic. It's very hard to say that, a lot of products will offer a guarantee, or this here we've designed for that issue, or this here we've designed for that issue. Same with girths, the girths that are designed with, an extra plate for things. It might
Or
seem like
anatomical
it's,
girths.
yeah, anatomical girths. It might seem like there's a perfect fix, but you still have to go through these assessments to say, okay, did this work for my horse, or was this something that is coming from somewhere else? And that's why posture has to come first, because even the best saddle or the best system is not going to fix a dysfunctional pattern. It's just the fact that a good saddle and a good fitting system like girth pad saddle allows the horse to improve with a saddle on.
Yeah.
So, the saddle doesn't actually improve anything without, the posture needing to be improved first too.
Yeah, 100%. And it's just really important to encourage, that collaboration with the saddle fitters, your body workers, and your trainers, because, like I said, a good body worker will pick up when your saddle is not right. Like you'll start asking questions about it, and a good trainer should as well, because they should be able to see your position and how you're, able to move with ease, or you're fighting against a saddle position. So really utilizing your team in that situation. So, and the one thing to really recognize is our horses are generally incredibly tolerant. I've seen a lot of horses with poor saddle fit who really do not display behaviors that their owners would think, is relating to poor saddle fit, especially ponies who love their kids. They're really super tolerant, most of them. And just thinking that, saddle fit is just a piece of the puzzle. And like Sophie said, we really want function, postural awareness before saddle fit, and then that's going to mean you're starting from an optimal place there. So do you have any takeaways there?
No, just like you said, it's a learning journey, and awareness is the first step towards better outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. Well, thank you for joining myself, Dr. Raquel Butler, and Sophie Vandenberg in today's podcast. Enjoy your horse turn. Go check your saddle fit. Please subscribe to the Equine Functional Posture podcast so you don't miss our weekly episodes, and give us a 5-star rating so we can share more valuable insights.
And we'll see you in the next exciting episode.